A young boy killed mother and baby in car accident. The car felt heavy. The air thick with silence. His hands trembled on the steering wheel. Cold beads of sweat on his forehead. Outside, the world seemed still. Frozen in place. As if nothing could move. The streetlights flickered faintly in the distance. Their yellow glow casting long shadows across the empty road. The sky was dark, a deep shade of purple. But something felt wrong. Too quiet. Too calm. He swallowed hard. The taste of metal in his mouth. He didn't remember the crash. But he remembered the screams. The sound of shattering glass. The sudden, sharp twist of metal. His heart pounded in his chest. Each beat louder than the last. His breath came in short gasps. The smell of gasoline lingered in the air. It burned his nose. It made him dizzy. He glanced to the side. The baby seat. Empty. The car seat was still there, but there was nothing inside. Nothing except a small stain of red. His mind raced. He couldn't think. The events blurred together. The crash. The chaos. The blood. He looked in the rearview mirror. The reflection was distorted. A strange, haunting image. His own face, twisted with confusion. A scream stuck in his throat. The sound of a baby's cry, echoing in his head. He shook his head. It couldn't be. It wasn't real. The road stretched out before him. Endless. But everything around him felt wrong. Too dark. Too quiet. The car began to slow. His foot pressed the brake, but it felt like the pedal was made of stone. Heavy. Unyielding. In the rearview, he saw headlights. Approaching. A figure stepped into view. He didn't know who it was. But they were getting closer. Closer. Closer still. The figure moved slowly. Almost gliding. Their shape barely visible in the dim light. A shadow among shadows. His heart thudded faster. A pulse that seemed to sync with his fear. The figure was getting closer. Closer. And closer. He could see nothing more than a silhouette. Tall. Thin. Looming over the road. His breath caught in his throat. The air felt colder. The car now felt even heavier. As if it were sinking into the pavement. The headlights from behind grew brighter. Filling the rearview mirror with a harsh, blinding light. The figure was close now. Too close. And then. A voice. Soft. Cold. The whisper of a name. His name. It sent a jolt through his body. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. The voice was familiar, but distorted. A woman's voice. Distant. Far away. Why did you? The words stopped mid-sentence. His throat tightened. He couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. A sharp pain shot through his chest. His eyes blurred. He couldn't look away from the rearview mirror. The figure was still there. Closer now. Too close. The face. He could see it now. A woman. Her eyes dark, hollow. Her mouth stretched into a twisted grin. And then, he saw it. The baby. Cradled in her arms. The small, lifeless body. His breath stopped. His hands went numb. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The woman's eyes locked with his. Her gaze sharp. Cold. Look what you've done, she whispered. The car stopped moving. Completely still. He couldn't move either. Frozen. The sound of his heart pounding. Louder now. Deafening. Then. Nothing. Complete silence. The world around him had vanished. Only darkness remained. The silence pressed in. Heavy. Suffocating. His breath came in shallow gasps. But the air felt wrong. Thick. Almost smothering. He tried to move. His body wouldn't obey. Stiff. Frozen. The woman in the rearview mirror was still there. Her eyes locked onto his. Piercing through the darkness. The baby. Cradled in her arms. Its tiny, still body. His stomach twisted. A knot that wouldn't untangle. "Please," he whispered. But the words felt strange on his tongue. Like they didn't belong to him. The woman's grin widened. Her lips pulling back. Revealing teeth too sharp, too white. Her eyes didn't blink. "Do you remember?" she asked. Her voice soft, like a song. But so cold. He closed his eyes. Tried to shut out the image of her. But the darkness only deepened. The sound of his pulse thundered in his ears. Suddenly, the air around him shifted. It grew colder. Sharp. The smell of gasoline. That sickening, metallic tang. Filled his nose. Choking him. His eyes snapped open. And the woman was gone. In the rearview mirror. Nothing. Just the empty road. The headlights from the car behind were fading. His hands shook. His chest heaved. He wanted to scream, but the sound was trapped inside. A crack in the glass. Tiny. Barely noticeable. But it was there. He reached out a trembling hand. Fingers brushing the cracked surface. It felt cold. And wrong. Like it wasn't real. And then. A sound. A thud. A soft thud. From the back seat. His heart skipped. He turned. But there was nothing. No baby. No woman. Just the silence. And then. Another thud. Louder this time. Closer. A whisper. Barely audible. "Look at what you've done." His eyes widened. He didn't want to look. But he had to. The rearview mirror. It was cracked. Shattered. In the broken pieces. He saw it. The baby. The woman. And his own reflection. His reflection. It was wrong. Twisted. A distorted version of himself. Eyes wide. Mouth open in silent horror. He stared at the mirror. Frozen. The pieces of glass catching the light. Shimmering. Sharp. Another thud came from the back seat. Closer now. A slow, deliberate tapping. His heartbeat raced faster. Each pulse louder than the last. He felt his chest tightening. His breath shallow. He turned to look behind him. Nothing. The back seat was empty. Yet the air was thick with an overwhelming presence. Something was there. He could feel it. Feel the weight of it. The silence in the car was suffocating. The only sound now. The sound of his own heartbeat. The thuds came again. Not from the seat. Not from the air. But from the very walls of the car. A soft tapping. Almost like fingernails scratching the glass. He didn't want to look. But his head turned against his will. And then. He saw it. A small hand. Tiny fingers pressing against the window. Covered in blood. His heart stopped. He couldn't breathe. The car seemed to close in on him. The walls pressing in. The air growing thinner. The hand moved. Dragged down the glass slowly. Leaving a trail of red. His breath came in gasps. His head swam. But he couldn't look away. The baby's face. Pale. Still. Its eyes wide open, staring at him. Unblinking. The smile of the woman from before echoed in his mind. That twisted grin. Her voice, a low whisper in the back of his mind. "You did this. His hands trembled violently now. He tried to grip the steering wheel. But his fingers wouldn't work. They were numb. The car didn't move. It was still. Frozen. The baby's face in the window. Its eyes. Still locked on him. The silence came again. Except now, it felt heavier. More oppressive. And then, for a brief moment, he heard it. A cry. A soft, distant cry. But it wasn't the baby's. It was a woman's voice. A mother's voice. A voice that echoed through the stillness. Why? The silence stretched. Endless. An oppressive void. He couldn't feel anything anymore. No weight of the seat beneath him. No breath in his lungs. Only darkness. Cold. A blackness so deep. It consumed everything. There was no sound. No movement. Just the crushing stillness. And then, a flicker. A tiny spark of light. Faint. Barely visible. It grew. Slowly. Until it filled the space. A soft glow in the infinite dark. The air was warmer now. Less suffocating. But still. It felt wrong. He could sense something. A presence. But it wasn't a person. It wasn't even alive. A voice. A whisper in the dark. Soft. Almost comforting. You can't escape. The words cut through the silence like a blade. Sharp. Cold. He tried to speak. But his mouth felt frozen shut. His tongue thick. Heavy. The glow around him grew brighter. Sharper. He blinked. And when he opened his eyes again, he saw it. A figure. Standing in the light. Tall. Dressed in dark clothing. It was the woman. Her face was still twisted in that same awful grin. Her eyes dark. Hollow. But there was something different. She wasn't angry anymore. She was calm. Almost serene. You know what you did, she said. Her voice like a lullaby. Soft but unnerving. His chest tightened again. The familiar ache returning. The memory hit him like a flood. The crash. The blood. The screams. The mother. The baby. Tears welled up in his eyes. But they didn't fall. His body felt paralyzed. She took a step forward. Slowly. Deliberately. The light casting eerie shadows across her face. You're not going anywhere, she whispered. Her eyes bored into his. You belong here now. The world around him shifted again. The air seemed to warp. Bend. Suddenly. The glow faded. The woman was gone. And he was left alone. In the dark. With only his thoughts. And the sound of his own heartbeat. But it wasn't just his heartbeat. It was the heartbeat of the baby. Faint. Echoing. He felt it inside him. Slowly. Growing louder. Thump. 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 And then. The whispers started again. You took them from me. The voice echoed in his head. Over and over. Until there was nothing left. Only the endless. Unforgiving darkness. The darkness was alive. It pulsed. Breathing around him. The whispers grew louder. Closer. Surrounding him. You took them. The words were soft at first. But now they echoed in every corner of his mind. The baby's cry. The mother's scream. The crash. He couldn't escape it. It was everywhere. His chest tightened again. He couldn't breathe. The heartbeat. It grew louder. Stronger. Thump. 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 It wasn't just in his head anymore. It was in the very air around him. He turned, frantically searching. But the darkness swallowed everything. Suddenly, there was a flash of light. Bright, blinding. The woman appeared again. But this time, she was different. Her smile was gone. Her eyes, no longer empty, but full of rage. "You will never be free," she said, her voice trembling with fury. Her hands reached out. Long fingers twisted like claws. Her face contorted with a new, deeper pain. The shadows around her grew, stretching like dark tendrils, wrapping around him, pulling him in. "You will stay here," she whispered, her voice now a shriek. The baby's cry pierced the air again. Sharp, wailing. He couldn't move. The shadows held him tight, squeezing the air from his lungs. He gasped for breath. But it was useless. He gasped for breath. But it was useless. There was nothing left to breathe. The baby's cry faded. Then, it stopped. And in the silence that followed, he felt something new. A weight pressing on his chest. It was heavy. Cold. Unforgiving. A deep, suffocating guilt. He could feel it now. Like the shadows were pulling his very soul from his body. The woman's face was in front of him now. Close. Her eyes burning with accusation. "You took them from me," she repeated. Her voice was a wail. A tortured, endless cry. And suddenly, he knew. It wasn't just the crash. It wasn't just the accident. It wasn't just his fault. It was everything. Everything he had ever done. All the choices he had made. The paths he had taken. And now, he was here. With no way out. The shadows closed in, filling every corner of his mind. He could feel his body fading. Disappearing. The guilt consumed him. The woman's voice, and the baby's cry, were the last things he heard. And then, there was nothing. No light. No sound. Only silence. Endless. Eternal silence. And in that silence, he drifted. A hollow echo of himself. The weight of guilt pressing down, filling the empty spaces of his soul. Time had no meaning here. No past. No future. Only the endless void. He felt nothing. No pain. No relief. Just the absence of everything. But then, a sound. Faint. Distant. A whisper. Soft. Barely audible. "Wake up." His heart skipped a beat. The voice was different. Gentler. But the words, they felt familiar. "Wake up." He tried to move. But his body was frozen. His mind trapped in a prison of its own making. The voice came again. Closer this time. More insistent. "Wake up, now." He fought against the darkness. Tried to force his eyes open. But the weight was too much. The shadows were suffocating. And then, a sudden jolt. A shock. His body snapped back. A violent, disorienting pull. The darkness cracked open. A thin sliver of light broke through. It was blinding at first. But he couldn't stop himself. He was being pulled toward it. The light grew brighter. Stronger. It swallowed him whole. He gasped. For the first time in what felt like eternity. He drew in a breath. Cold. Sharp. Real. He opened his eyes. And everything was different. The shadows were gone. The weight of guilt vanished. He was in a new place now. Bright. Silent. He blinked, trying to adjust. But something was wrong. His body was no longer his own. It felt distant, detached. And then he realized. He was standing. But he was not alone. A figure stood before him. Small. Fragile. A child. The baby. But the baby was different now. Its eyes were wide open. Unblinking. And its mouth was moving. Whispering words he couldn't understand. A voice from behind him called out. But it wasn't the woman. It was something else. Something deeper. Older. "You've never left," it said. The world around him twisted. The ground beneath his feet shuddered. And the baby's eyes locked onto his. He took a step back. But it was too late. The shadows were returning. Slowly. Darkening the world again. The baby's voice rose in volume. Now a scream. A cry of anguish. And the woman's voice. It came again. "You took them from me, and now you'll never escape." The darkness closed in once more. And this time, he could feel it pulling him down. Pulling him into an endless, suffocating abyss. Forever. The darkness tightened around him. A crushing weight. The air thickened. No room to breathe. He reached out. His fingers brushing against the fading light. But it slipped through his hands. The baby's cry echoed. Sharp and relentless. It tore at his mind. The sound reverberated in his skull. A constant, gnawing presence. The shadows closed in. Wrapping themselves around his limbs. He couldn't move. He couldn't scream. Only the suffocating silence of the abyss. And then. A whisper. Cold. Familiar. "You can't run from this." It wasn't the woman's voice this time. It was deeper. More ancient. His heart thundered in his chest. The guilt, the weight of his actions, pulled him deeper into the void. The world around him began to shift. Twisting. Bending. He felt himself being drawn down. Into the very core of the darkness. A sudden flash of light. So blinding he couldn't look. And when it faded, he was somewhere new. A cold, barren place. A desolate, empty landscape. A wasteland. The ground cracked beneath his feet. There were no trees, no sky. Just an endless, gray void. The baby was there, too. But it was different now. Its form distorted. Its eyes hollow. Dead. And beside it, the woman. Her face was pale. Twisted with rage. Her mouth curled into a snarl. "You'll never be free." Her voice was a hiss. The ground beneath him trembled. Shadows crawled from the cracks. Rising like serpents. The air thickened. Heavy with a presence he couldn't escape. The darkness was here. And it was hungry. He tried to run. But his legs wouldn't move. His body betrayed him. The baby's cry rang out again. Louder. Closer. The shadows wrapped around him like chains. Tightening with each passing moment. And then. A figure appeared. A shadow in the distance. A shape he couldn't make out. But it was moving toward him. Slowly. Deliberately. He could feel the temperature drop. The air growing colder. Frost forming on his skin. The figure drew nearer. Its form becoming clearer. It was a man. Tall. Wearing dark clothes.
But it wasn't just any man. It was him. The reflection of himself. Standing in front of him. His own eyes stared back. Dark, hollow, empty. "You don't get to escape," his reflection said. The words were a curse. A sentence. And the shadows surged. They pulled him in, drawing him closer to the reflection. The baby's cry stopped. The woman's voice was silent. All that remained was him. And the reflection. As the darkness swallowed him whole, he finally understood. There was no escape. Not now. Not ever. The darkness wasn't just around him. It was inside him. And he was lost forever. The shadows pressed in tighter, suffocating him. His chest tightened, his breath shallow. He tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat, swallowed by the ever-encroaching darkness. His reflection stood before him, its hollow eyes locked onto his. The same face, the same expression. But it wasn't him anymore. It was what he had become. The man in the mirror spoke again, his voice low, gravelly. "You've always been here." The words twisted around him like a noose, tightening with every passing second. The reflection reached out a hand, slowly, almost lovingly. "Don't run from it," it whispered. "You can't escape who you are." The hand brushed against his face, cold, unfeeling. The touch sent a shock through his body, numbing him to the core. He tried to pull away, but the shadows wrapped around him, dragging him closer. There was no air left to breathe, no room to move, no light to guide him. All he could do was look into his own eyes, those hollow eyes staring back at him. The baby's cry echoed again, faint, distant, but growing louder, closer. And then, the woman's voice. "You took them from me." Her words felt like knives, piercing his mind, digging deep into his soul. The reflection in front of him grinned, a cruel, twisted smile. "You're the one who made this happen." And in that moment, he realized he was not just trapped in the darkness. He was the darkness. The weight of it crushed him. The guilt, the shame. It consumed him. There was no way out. No escape. And then, the world shifted. The ground beneath him trembled. The air grew colder still. He could feel the temperature drop, ice creeping across his skin. The shadows began to shift. They twisted, reforming into something else. A figure emerged from the darkness. Tall, shrouded in a cloak of black. It was the same figure from before, the one who had been watching him. But now it wasn't just a figure. It was something more. Something ancient. Something infinite. The figure reached out toward him, its hand cold, impossibly cold. "You can never leave," it whispered. And with that, the darkness closed in around him. The last breath of air disappeared. The last sound faded. And all that was left was the void, forever. The darkness was complete. Nothing. A vast, empty void where even time had ceased to exist. He could feel it now, the oppressive weight of his own guilt. It surrounded him, suffocating him in a way that was both physical and mental. His chest tightened, a tightness he couldn't escape. No matter how deeply he tried to breathe, it felt like the air was running out. The whispers, so faint at first, gradually grew louder. "You took them. You killed them." The words cut through him like blades. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the images came anyway. The crash. The blood. The baby's lifeless body. The mother's haunting, accusing stare. And then, the baby's cry. It was faint at first, but it grew. The sound twisted in his mind, sharp and unforgiving. His stomach turned. He was shaking now, sweat cold on his skin. His heart was pounding, faster and faster. He wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but his voice was swallowed by the void. The cry was getting closer. It was coming from somewhere, but he couldn't see where. And then, a figure emerged. At first, just a shape in the darkness. Slowly, it became clearer. A woman. The woman. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, yet filled with an endless, unyielding rage. Her lips moved, but no sound came. The baby was there too, clutched in her arms, its tiny body limp, its eyes wide open, staring directly at him. She took a step toward him, and the ground trembled beneath her feet. The shadows seemed to shift with her movement. "You killed them," she whispered, her voice low but sharp, like the tip of a blade. His chest tightened even more, as if his heart was being squeezed. The darkness pressed in. He felt himself falling, Into it. Into the cold, the emptiness. No, he whispered. I didn't mean to. But his words were drowned out by the baby's cry. Now a wail. Louder. Closer. And then everything went silent. The void wasn't empty anymore. It was full of weight. Full of guilt. He opened his eyes. And there, in the blackness, he saw the truth. The darkness was not just around him. It was inside him. It was always there. And he would never escape. The darkness was overwhelming. A suffocating weight that pressed against him from all sides. He couldn't see, couldn't breathe, only feel the cold emptiness that stretched on forever. His body was numb, his mind fragmented. The world had dissolved into nothing but shadows and whispers. For a moment, he thought he might lose himself completely, vanish into the void. But then, a faint light appeared, a flicker, distant but undeniable. It grew, slowly, like the first light of dawn breaking through the night. He tried to move toward it. His feet felt heavy, as if the darkness itself was holding him back. But he forced himself to take a step. And then another.
The whispers grew louder. More frantic. You can't escape. You've done this. The words clawed at his mind, digging deep into his very soul. But he kept moving. The light growing clearer now. It felt warmer. Brighter. More real than anything else in this endless void. And then, a figure appeared. A shape in the light. At first, he thought it was her. The woman. But it wasn't. It was him. The person he had once been. His own reflection. Standing before him. No anger. No judgment. Just peace. The reflection didn't speak. It simply reached out a hand. And he took it. The moment his fingers touched the reflection's hand, the darkness shattered. Like glass breaking into 1,000 pieces. The light washed over him, clearing the shadows, sweeping them away. And as the last fragment of the void faded, he felt something he hadn't felt in what seemed like eternity. A breath. Deep, full, real. He opened his eyes. And the world around him was no longer black. It was soft. A gentle light filling the space. He was standing on solid ground now. Breathing freely. The weight of guilt was gone. The darkness had lifted. The echoes of the past faded. Until they were nothing more than a distant memory. He wasn't free from what he had done. But he had learned something. You don't have to carry the weight of your mistakes forever. In that moment, he knew there was hope. And with that, he stepped forward. Into the light.